Tonight we pull back the marble curtain on the most depraved, disturbing, and deliberately hidden chapters of Roman imperial history, where absolute power didn't just corrupt absolutely. It created monsters whose appetites were so grotesque that Rome itself spent centuries trying to erase them from memory. Before we continue deeper into these ancient shadows, take a quiet moment to subscribe if these forgotten stories bring you peace. And if you're still drifting with us, let us know in the comments where you're listening from tonight. It's always fascinating to see who joins us from around the world as we wander through history's quieter moments. What you're about to hear isn't just shocking, it's the kind of truth that empires bury beneath propaganda and patrician silence. The Roman Empire gave us roads, aqueducts, and legal systems that still govern our world today. But it also gave us something else entirely, a parade of sexually deviant autocrats whose private lives read like the fever dreams of a deeply disturbed screenwriter. These weren't just powerful men with wandering eyes or political marriages gone wrong. These were emperors who turned the sacred office of Caesar into a stage for the most spectacular displays of sexual cruelty, psychological torture, and moral bankruptcy the ancient world had ever witnessed. And here's the thing that makes this story even more chilling. Rome knew exactly what kind of monsters were wearing the purple. The senators knew. The historians knew. The people whispered about it in the streets. But for centuries afterward, official histories were scrubbed clean. Statues were recarved, and inscriptions were chiseled away in a desperate attempt to preserve the dignity of imperial office. This is the story they didn't want you to know. The real story of power without limits and appetites without shame. To understand how Rome produced such spectacular perverts, you first need to understand what unlimited power does to the human psyche. The Roman Empire wasn't just vast. It was a machine designed to concentrate godlike authority in the hands of a single man. The emperor controlled armies that could level cities, treasuries that could bankrupt kingdoms, and legal systems that could condemn anyone to death on a whim. More importantly, he controlled the historical narrative itself. When you can rewrite history, execute witnesses, and command the silence of an entire civilization, there are no meaningful checks on behavior. The Roman Senate, once a proud deliberative body, had been reduced to a gathering of terrified yes-men whose primary survival strategy was enthusiastic applause for whatever fresh horror their emperor unveiled. Opposition meant death, silence meant complicity, and complicity meant watching the most powerful office on earth transform into a playground for the criminally insane. The palace system made everything worse. The imperial court wasn't just a government. It was a closed ecosystem where the emperor's word was literal law and his desires, no matter how depraved, became everyone else's reality. Servants who witnessed imperial atrocities knew that their continued breathing depended on amnesia. Guards who escorted victims to private chambers understood that discretion wasn't just professional courtesy, it was survival. Court officials who arranged imperial entertainments learned to smile while facilitating horrors that would make modern war criminals blush. This system didn't just enable individual perverts, it mass-produced them. When absolute power meets zero accountability, when sexual violence becomes a demonstration of authority, when human dignity becomes a luxury that only the emperor can afford to ignore, you don't get eccentric rulers. You get predators wearing crowns. What makes the story of Rome's perverted emperors even more disturbing is how systematically the empire tried to cover it up. This wasn't just casual historical revisionism. It was an organized campaign to scrub the imperial record clean of its most embarrassing chapters. Later dynasties understood that their own legitimacy depended on maintaining the dignity of the office they'd inherited, even if previous occupants had used that office as a license for sexual terrorism. The process was called damnatio memoria, the damnation of memory, and it was brutally thorough. Statues were destroyed or recarved with different faces. Coins were melted down and reminted. Official inscriptions were chiseled away from public monuments, leaving blank spaces where imperial names once stood. Literary works that portrayed emperors unfavorably were burned or lost in mysterious library fires. Even paintings and mosaics were altered, with offensive emperors literally erased from artistic depictions of imperial ceremonies. But the most insidious part of the cover-up was how it shaped the historical record itself. Ancient historians weren't independent journalists. They were members of the same aristocratic class that had enabled imperial depravity through their silence and complicity. When they finally wrote about dead emperors, they had powerful incentives to downplay the worst excesses, blame everything on barbarian influences or foreign corruption, and present imperial perversion as the exception rather than the rule. This is why reading ancient accounts of imperial sex lives feels like watching someone describe a nuclear explosion through a kaleidoscope. You get fragments of truth, distorted by political necessity and wrapped in euphemisms that were designed to preserve upper-class sensibilities. When Suetonius writes that an emperor was not temperate with women, he's using the ancient equivalent of saying someone had boundary issues. When Tacitus mentions that a ruler indulged in private entertainments, he's describing orgies that would make modern horror films seem like children's programming. The most tragic part of this story isn't what the emperors did, it's what their subjects endured in silence. Behind every imperial atrocity was a trail of victims whose suffering was erased along with their abusers' reputations. Aristocratic wives who were sexually humiliated at state banquets couldn't speak about their trauma without risking their family's destruction. Young men who were assaulted in imperial bedchambers learned that survival meant amnesia. Children who were victimized by emperors with pedophilic appetites grew up knowing that their pain was literally unspeakable in a society that worshipped their abusers as gods. The cover-up wasn't just about protecting imperial dignity, it was about protecting a system that had made imperial depravity possible in the first place. If Romans acknowledged that their god emperors were sexual predators, they'd have to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of absolute power and their own complicity in maintaining it. It was easier to blame individual bad emperors and pretend that the system itself wasn't fundamentally corrupted. But some stories were too big to bury completely. Some atrocities were so spectacular, so witnessed, so thoroughly documented that even the most aggressive historical revisionism couldn't erase them entirely. These are the stories that survived, not because they were typical, but because they were so extreme that silence became impossible. And those stories, the ones that Rome couldn't quite manage to hide, reveal a pattern of sexual violence and psychological cruelty that transforms our understanding of imperial power. These weren't just perverted individuals who happened to become emperors. These were products of a system that turned human beings into gods, and then expressed shock when those gods behaved like monsters. What you're about to hear isn't just ancient history. It's a case study in what happens when power becomes absolute, when accountability disappears, and when entire civilizations choose complicity over courage. The names and places are Roman, but the dynamics are eternal, and the lessons, uncomfortable as they may be, are devastatingly relevant to anyone living under concentrated power in any era. The marble curtain is about to fall. The sanitized history is about to crack. And the real story of imperial Rome, bloody, depraved, and deliberately hidden, is about to emerge from 2,000 years of carefully orchestrated silence. Before we dive into the specific horrors perpetrated by individual emperors, we need to understand the machine that manufactured these monsters. The Roman imperial system wasn't just politically corrupt, It was psychologically toxic, designed in ways that virtually guaranteed the production of sexual predators wearing purple robes. The transformation began with Augustus, the first emperor, who understood that raw power needed theatrical packaging to become palatable. He didn't just seize control of Rome, he created an elaborate performance where absolute authority was disguised as public service. The emperor became father of the nation, high priest of the state religion, and ultimate judge of morality, all while operating under legal frameworks that placed him above the very laws he supposedly embodied. This wasn't accidental. Augustus deliberately constructed a system where the emperor existed in a legal and moral vacuum. He could command anyone's death, confiscate anyone's property, and violate anyone's family, all while maintaining the fiction that he was bound by Roman tradition and constitutional precedent. The result was a form of institutionalized schizophrenia, where unlimited power hid behind elaborate displays of civic virtue. The imperial palace wasn't just a residence, it was a carefully designed ecosystem for manufacturing compliance and enabling abuse. Every aspect of palace life was structured to reinforce the emperor's absolute authority, while providing maximum opportunity for private misconduct. The layout itself told the story: public spaces where the emperor performed virtue, and private quarters where literally anything could happen without consequence. Palace staff were selected not for competence but for vulnerability. Slaves, freedmen, and foreign-born servants made ideal accomplices because they had no legal standing, no powerful families to protect them, and no realistic hope of justice if they witnessed or experienced imperial crimes. The emperor's personal bodyguard, supposedly there for protection, functioned more like a private army of enforcers who understood that their primary job was ensuring silence about whatever happened behind closed doors. The most insidious element was how the palace normalized sexual violence through gradual escalation. New emperors didn't typically start with the worst atrocities. They were systematically desensitized through a culture that treated human beings as disposable entertainment. Palace banquets featured performances that gradually became more explicit and degrading. Private parties introduced elements of coercion and humiliation that incrementally pushed boundaries until nothing seemed shocking anymore. Court officials learned to facilitate these escalations while maintaining plausible deniability. When an emperor requested entertainment, everyone understood what that meant, but the euphemistic language allowed participants to pretend they weren't enabling sexual crimes. When powerful families were invited to bring their wives and daughters to honor the emperor, the real purpose was understood by all parties, but the formal pretense of respect made resistance seem ungrateful or treasonous. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of imperial sexual predation was how enthusiastically Rome's elite participated in their own degradation. Senators who should have been checks on imperial power instead became procurers and accomplices, offering their own family members to secure political advantage. The Roman aristocracy didn't just tolerate imperial sexual violence, they actively facilitated it through a complex system of political prostitution disguised as social honor. This complicity wasn't born from fear alone, though terror certainly played a role. It emerged from an aristocratic culture that had already commodified family relationships for political gain. Roman marriages were business transactions. Roman children were investment opportunities. When emperors demanded sexual access to aristocratic women, they were simply claiming the ultimate political payment in a system that had already reduced human relationships to currency. The most successful senatorial families learned to anticipate imperial desires and offer preemptive compliance. They trained their daughters in palace etiquette that was really preparation for sexual exploitation. They taught their sons to accept public humiliation as the price of political advancement. They created family cultures where surviving imperial attention, no matter how degrading, was considered a mark of loyalty and sophistication. This created a feedback loop where imperial sexual predation became increasingly normalized and sophisticated. Early emperors had to work to overcome aristocratic resistance to their advances. Later emperors found victims delivered with ribbons and thank you notes attached. The system had trained Rome's most powerful families to function as suppliers for the imperial appetite, and they performed this role with the same efficiency they brought to tax collection and military recruitment. The most psychologically devastating aspect of imperial sexual predation was how it wrapped itself in religious authority. The emperor wasn't just a political leader, he was the high priest of the state religion, the earthly representative of the gods, and increasingly viewed as divine himself. This meant that imperial sexual demands carried not just political weight but religious obligation. Victims of imperial sexual violence couldn't just refuse a powerful man, they were refusing a god. Families who provided daughters for imperial pleasure weren't just securing political advantage, they were participating in sacred rituals. Guards who facilitated imperial rapes weren't just following orders, they were serving divine will. The religious framework transformed sexual crimes into holy sacraments, making resistance not just dangerous but blasphemous. This religious justification also provided psychological cover for everyone involved. Emperors could tell themselves they were claiming divine prerogatives rather than committing crimes. Aristocratic families could frame their compliance as religious devotion rather than political prostitution. Palace staff could view their facilitation of sexual violence as sacred service rather than criminal conspiracy. The entire system operated under a veneer of religious legitimacy that made moral resistance seem not just futile but impious. The genius of this arrangement was how it eliminated the possibility of meaningful moral judgment. When the highest religious authority in the empire was also its primary sexual predator, traditional concepts of virtue and vice became meaningless. The emperor didn't break moral laws. He defined them. He didn't violate religious principles. He embodied them. He didn't commit crimes. He exercised divine prerogatives that mere mortals couldn't understand or judge. By the end of the 1st century, the Roman imperial system had perfected a process for manufacturing sexual predators on an industrial scale. Every structural element reinforced the others. Legal immunity enabled escalating crimes. Religious authority justified any behavior. Aristocratic complicity provided endless victims, and palace culture normalized the unthinkable. New emperors entered this system as products of the same toxic environment that had shaped their predecessors. They were raised in palace culture where sexual violence was routine, educated by tutors who taught compliance over conscience, and mentored by advisors whose careers depended on facilitating imperial desires rather than restraining them. The system didn't corrupt good men. It prevented good men from emerging in the first place. This is why the roll call of perverted emperors reads less like a series of individual moral failures and more like a production line of institutionally manufactured monsters. Each emperor inherited not just political power but a fully operational infrastructure for sexual predation, complete with experienced staff, established procedures, and cultural justifications that made resistance seem impossible and compliance seem natural. The machine was running perfectly. All it needed was fresh victims and new operators willing to push the boundaries even further than their predecessors. And Rome in its infinite creativity was about to provide both in abundance. The man who would become Augustus started his career as Octavian, a teenager whose rise to power was paved with strategic sexual compromises that would make a modern political operative blush. But by the time he died as Rome's revered first emperor, official history had transformed him into a paragon of moral virtue and family values. This miraculous transformation wasn't divine intervention. It was the first successful demonstration of how imperial spin could sanitize even the most sordid sexual reputation. Augustus didn't invent imperial sexual predation, but he perfected the art of making it respectable. His genius wasn't in restraining his appetites. It was in creating a system where those appetites could operate under the cover of moral reform and political necessity. He turned sexual exploitation into statecraft and made depravity look like civic duty. Before he became the divine Augustus, Octavian was just another ambitious young Roman willing to trade sexual favors for political advancement. His most notorious early relationship was with Aulus Hirtius, a consul and military commander who paid the teenage Octavian 300,000 sesterces for sexual access, a fortune that represented several lifetimes of income for ordinary Romans. This wasn't a romantic affair or even casual prostitution. It was a calculated business transaction where Octavian sold his body to secure the political connections that would eventually make him emperor. The arrangement was so well known that Octavian's enemies never let him forget it. Lucius Antonius, brother of Mark Antony, would later taunt him publicly about his bargain basement price for submission, while Sextus Pompey mocked his reputation for molestia, the Roman term for effeminate sexual behavior that suggested weakness and political unreliability. These weren't just personal insults. They were strategic attacks designed to undermine Octavian's credibility in a culture that worshipped masculine dominance. But Octavian understood something his critics missed in Roman politics. Sexual humiliation was temporary, but power was permanent. He endured the mockery, collected his payments, and used the resources to build the military and political alliances that would eventually destroy everyone who had laughed at his youthful compromises. By the time he became Augustus, most of his former clients were dead, and the survivors had learned the wisdom of selective amnesia. Even more disturbing was how Octavian weaponized his own sexual exploitation as a template for controlling others. Having learned how sexual compromise could be used to secure loyalty and silence, he began applying the same techniques to potential rivals and allies. The teenager who had sold himself to Hirtius grew into an emperor who understood that sexual humiliation was one of the most effective tools for political control. As emperor, Augustus developed what can only be described as an industrial approach to sexual predation, with specialized systems for identifying, acquiring, and disposing of victims. His most notorious obsession was deflowering virgins, not as romantic conquest or even casual pleasure, but as a demonstration of absolute power over Roman society's most protected demographic. The process was chillingly systematic. Augustus's friends functioned as talent scouts, identifying suitable candidates among the daughters of aristocratic families. Like ancient human traffickers, they would arrange social gatherings where potential victims could be evaluated and selected. The chosen girls would then be brought to palace events under the pretense of honoring their families, only to find themselves trapped in a system designed to make resistance impossible and escape unthinkable. Most disturbing was how Augustus's wife Livia actively participated in this procurement operation. Rather than challenging her husband's predatory behavior, she organized and refined it, turning the deflowering of virgins into a specialized palace service. Livia's involvement wasn't just marital complicity, it was active collaboration in sexual crimes wrapped in the authority of imperial family values and domestic management. The victims had no realistic recourse. Refusing the emperor meant destroying their family's political prospects and potentially facing charges of treason. Complying meant enduring sexual assault disguised as imperial favor. Speaking out afterward risked not just personal destruction but the annihilation of entire family lines. Augustus had created a perfect trap where resistance was impossible, compliance was mandatory, and silence was enforced through institutional terror. Augustus refined the art of using sexual humiliation as a tool of political control, turning private predation into public spectacle designed to reinforce his dominance over Rome's elite. His banquet performances were legendary for their calculated cruelty. He would select aristocratic wives from the dining crowd, disappear with them into his private chambers, and return displaying clear evidence of what had occurred: disheveled hair, flushed faces, torn clothing. The genius of these performances wasn't just the sexual gratification, it was the political message. Every husband forced to smile while his wife was publicly violated understood that his own political survival depended on enthusiastic approval of his own humiliation. Every father who watched his daughter, selected for imperial attention, learned that family honor was a luxury he couldn't afford. Every senator who applauded these displays participated in his own degradation while demonstrating absolute loyalty to imperial authority. Augustus made these humiliations routine parts of state functions, transforming sexual violence into a standard element of Roman political theatre. Foreign ambassadors witnessed these performances and understood that Roman power extended beyond military might into the complete psychological domination of its own elite. Domestic audiences learned that traditional concepts of family honor and personal dignity were privileges that existed only at imperial pleasure. The most insidious aspect was how Augustus presented these humiliations as expressions of democratic accessibility. He wasn't just taking what he wanted, he was graciously sharing his divine presence with honored families who should be grateful for the attention. The sexual violence was reframed as imperial generosity, the humiliation as privilege, the trauma as honor. Victims were expected not just to endure, but to express gratitude for their own abuse. Perhaps Augustus's most audacious achievement was implementing sweeping moral reforms while simultaneously operating the most sophisticated sexual predation network in Roman history. His legislation promoted family values, punished adultery, and encouraged virtuous behavior, all while he maintained what amounted to a private harem staffed through systematic coercion and institutional violence. The Augustan marriage laws were masterpieces of hypocrisy, creating legal frameworks that enhanced his own access to other men's wives while punishing ordinary Romans for far lesser sexual infractions. Citizens could be exiled for adultery, while the emperor maintained multiple sexual relationships under the protection of imperial immunity. Families were required to produce legitimate heirs while the emperor disposed of his own inconvenient offspring through abortion, exposure, and strategic marriages that amounted to trafficking. This wasn't mere hypocrisy, it was strategic moral control that enhanced rather than limited imperial sexual predation. By positioning himself as the guardian of Roman virtue, Augustus made criticism of his own behavior seem like attacks on public morality itself. He had weaponized moral authority to create additional opportunities for sexual exploitation while making resistance appear not just dangerous but immoral. Augustus died peacefully in his bed, surrounded by grieving subjects who genuinely mourned the passing of their beloved father emperor. The virgin deflowering, the public humiliations, the systematic sexual terrorism, all of it had been successfully reframed as the eccentric privileges of divine authority. He had created the template that future emperors would follow: unlimited sexual predation disguised as political necessity and moral leadership. The first emperor had shown the way, the worst was yet to come. If Augustus created the template for imperial sexual predation, Tiberius perfected it into an art form of sustained psychological torture that defied every boundary of human decency. When the second emperor retreated to his island fortress on Capri in 26 CE, he didn't just escape the pressures of ruling, he created a laboratory for sexual experimentation that would have made the Marquis de Sade take notes. For 11 years, Tiberius transformed the scenic Mediterranean paradise into what can only be described as a state-sponsored pedophile resort, complete with specialized staff, custom facilities, and procurement networks that supplied an endless stream of victims. The man who had once been Rome's most respected general became a sexual predator so notorious that his very name became synonymous with depravity for centuries afterward. Tiberius didn't just indulge his appetites on Capri, he created an entire infrastructure dedicated to sexual sadism. The imperial villa was redecorated with explicit pornographic murals that served both as inspiration and instruction manual for the emperor's increasingly elaborate fantasies. These weren't artistic celebrations of human sexuality, they were graphic depictions of violence, coercion, and degradation that functioned as blueprints for imperial entertainment. The most notorious spaces were the private bathhouses where Tiberius conducted his signature atrocity, training infants he called his little fish to swim between his thighs and nibble on his genitals while he soaked in the warm waters. This wasn't momentary madness or drunken impulse, it was a systematic program that required specialized staff to procure babies, custom pools designed for optimal access, and carefully developed techniques for training infants to perform specific sexual acts. Even more disturbing were the nursery chambers where Tiberius would take newborn babies from their mothers and hold them against his genitals, attempting to stimulate himself by manipulating their natural suckling reflexes. Palace wet nurses were required to facilitate these sessions, essentially functioning as accomplices in the sexual abuse of infants who couldn't even comprehend what was being done to them. Tiberius's appetite extended beyond infants to organized sexual performances that combined child abuse with theatrical spectacle. His tight bums were groups of young boys trained to perform elaborate sexual acts in front of the emperor and his guests, functioning as live pornography designed to stimulate Tiberius's increasingly dysfunctional libido. These weren't casual encounters, they were choreographed performances with costumes, scripts, and specialized training that transformed child sexual abuse into imperial entertainment. The performances grew increasingly elaborate and violent as Tiberius's appetites required ever more extreme stimulation. What began as simple sexual displays evolved into sadistic spectacles involving physical torture, psychological terror, and combinations of pleasure and pain that pushed the boundaries of what human beings could endure. The children involved weren't just sexually abused, they were systematically broken down psychologically until they became willing participants in their own degradation. Palace records, later discovered and hastily destroyed, apparently contained detailed logs of these performances, including notes on which children were most responsive to different forms of stimulation, and which combinations of torture and pleasure produced the most satisfying results for imperial viewing. Tiberius had turned child sexual abuse into a science, complete with experimental protocols and performance metrics. Tiberius's dinner parties became legendary exercises in psychological torture that combined sexual sadism with demonstrations of absolute power. His favorite entertainment involved forcing guests to drink enormous quantities of wine while preventing them from urinating by tying ligatures around their penises, a form of torture that combined physical agony with sexual humiliation while making the victims complicit in their own suffering. The genius of these tortures was how they implicated the victims in their own abuse. Guests couldn't refuse the wine without insulting their emperor, but accepting meant enduring hours of escalating agony while maintaining the pretense that they were enjoying imperial hospitality. They were forced to smile and express gratitude while experiencing excruciating pain, creating psychological trauma that extended far beyond the physical suffering. Even more disturbing was how these tortures became social bonding experiences among Tiberius's inner circle. Surviving the emperor's dinner parties became a mark of political reliability and personal toughness. Men who had endured sexual humiliation and physical torture together formed intimate bonds based on shared trauma and mutual complicity. Tiberius had weaponized sadism to create a political class bound together by shame and mutual blackmail. Tiberius's sexual violence wasn't limited to slaves and commoners. He specifically targeted aristocratic women as a way of demonstrating his power over Rome's most protected and prestigious families. The assault of Malonia, which drove her to suicide rather than submit to repeated imperial rape, became a template for how Tiberius used sexual violence to control political opposition and demonstrate the futility of resistance. These weren't crimes of passion or opportunity. They were calculated political acts designed to break the spirit of potential opposition while providing sexual gratification as a bonus. When Tiberius raped a senator's wife, he wasn't just satisfying personal desires. He was sending a message to every aristocratic family that their most sacred relationships existed only at imperial pleasure. The psychological impact extended far beyond the immediate victims. Every senator who brought his wife to Capri understood that he was potentially delivering her to sexual assault. Every aristocratic family that maintained political connections to the imperial court was implicated in a system that treated their daughters and wives as disposable entertainment for imperial pleasure. For 11 years, this monster ruled the known world from his island fortress, turning the Mediterranean's most beautiful destination into a monument to human depravity. When Tiberius finally died in 37 CE, Romans celebrated in the streets, not because they had loved him, but because they had finally escaped a nightmare that seemed to have no end. But their relief was premature. Tiberius had trained a successor who would prove that imperial depravity could always get worse. Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus earned the nickname Caligula from the tiny military boots his father dressed him in as a child, but history would remember him for far more sinister reasons. After surviving the psychological torture chamber of Tiberius's court, where he learned to hide his true feelings while watching his entire family systematically murdered, Caligula emerged as emperor with a carefully concealed appetite for sexual cruelty that would make his predecessors' depravities seem almost quaint by comparison. For 4 years, Caligula transformed the Roman Empire into his personal sexual playground, where the boundaries between family politics and pornography dissolved into a nightmare of imperial excess that shocked even a society already desensitized to sexual violence. His reign wasn't just politically disastrous, it was a sustained assault on every concept of human dignity and familial sanctity that Roman society held sacred. Caligula's most notorious alleged crime was the systematic sexual abuse of his 3 sisters, particularly his obsession with Drusilla, whom ancient sources claim he deflowered during childhood and later treated as his unofficial wife. While historians debate the truth of these incest allegations, the sheer consistency of the accounts suggests something genuinely disturbing was happening within the imperial family, something so shocking that even Roman writers accustomed to imperial excess felt compelled to document it despite the political risks. The relationship with Drusilla went far beyond mere sexual misconduct. It was a public humiliation of her legitimate husband and a deliberate assault on Roman concepts of family honor. Caligula didn't just sleep with his sister, he paraded her at public events as his consort, forcing her husband Cassius Longinus to watch while the emperor openly displayed his sexual dominance over another man's wife. This wasn't hidden vice, it was performed degradation designed to demonstrate that imperial power extended into the most intimate family relationships. When Drusilla died in 38 CE, Caligula's grief transformed into something approaching madness. He didn't just mourn her death, he deified her, making sexual obsession with his sister into an official state religion. Roman citizens were required to worship the woman Caligula had allegedly been sexually abusing since childhood, creating a grotesque fusion of familial dysfunction and religious authority that made imperial perversion into mandatory public devotion. Even more disturbing were the rumors that Caligula forced his other sisters, Agrippina and Livilla, to participate in sexual performances that combined incest with public exhibition. Palace banquets allegedly featured scenes where Caligula positioned himself between multiple sisters while guests were forced to watch and applaud. These weren't private indulgences, they were state-sponsored sexual spectacles that transformed familial relationships into imperial entertainment. Caligula refined Augustus's techniques for sexually humiliating Rome's elite into a systematic program of psychological warfare disguised as social events. His dinner parties became elaborate theatrical productions where aristocratic wives were transformed into unwilling performers in sexual dramas designed to destroy their husband's dignity while providing imperial entertainment. The process was chillingly methodical. Caligula would require senators to bring their wives to palace banquets where the women would be forced to parade past the imperial couch while the emperor examined them like livestock at market. He would comment publicly on their physical attributes, rating their sexual appeal and speculating about their performance potential while their husbands sat frozen in terror, knowing that any objection meant death, and any agreement meant complicity in their own humiliation. The selection process was deliberately drawn out to maximize psychological torture. Caligula would spend entire dinners evaluating and re-evaluating his options, sometimes changing his mind multiple times to keep the tension unbearable. When he finally made his choice, the selected woman would be escorted to the imperial chambers while her husband was forced to continue dining and making conversation as if nothing had happened. The return was even more sadistic. When the woman came back to the dining hall, disheveled, traumatized, and bearing obvious signs of sexual assault, Caligula would provide detailed commentary on her performance, discussing her techniques, enthusiasm, and physical attributes in front of her husband and the assembled company. He turned rape into performance review, sexual assault into public humiliation, and marital destruction into imperial entertainment. Perhaps most shocking was Caligula's affair with the pantomime actor Minister, which he conducted with such shameless publicity that he would rush onto the stage during performances to kiss and grope his lover in front of horrified audiences. In Roman society, actors ranked barely above slaves in social status, making the emperor's public passion for the Minister a deliberate assault on imperial dignity and social hierarchy. But this wasn't just sexual gratification, it was political theater designed to demonstrate that imperial power could overturn any social convention or moral boundary. When the Emperor of Rome publicly degraded himself with a social inferior, he was sending a message that traditional Roman values were meaningless luxuries that existed only at his pleasure. If the emperor could abandon dignity and status in pursuit of sexual gratification, then every other social institution was equally vulnerable to imperial whim. The Mnester affair also served as a form of sexual blackmail against the aristocracy. When senators were forced to watch their emperor debase himself with an actor, they understood that their own traditional concepts of honor and propriety were being deliberately mocked. They were required to applaud performances that violated everything they claimed to believe about proper behavior, making them complicit in the destruction of their own value systems. Caligula's reign demonstrated how sexual predation could become a form of political terrorism that extended far beyond the immediate victims. Every family that attended imperial events risked sexual assault. Every marriage that came to imperial attention faced potential destruction. Every concept of personal honor or family dignity became subject to imperial manipulation and degradation. The psychological impact was devastating and far-reaching. Roman society had prided itself on concepts of familial honor, marital fidelity, and social hierarchy. Caligula systematically destroyed all of these, turning respected institutions into sources of terror and humiliation. He didn't just commit sexual crimes, he weaponized sexuality to attack the foundational structures of Roman civilization itself. When Caligula was finally assassinated in 41 CE, his death was greeted with relief that bordered on religious ecstasy. But the damage was done. He had shown future emperors just how far imperial sexual predation could extend, and how effectively sexual violence could be used to terrorize an entire civilization into submission. The monster was dead, but the system that had created him remained intact, ready to produce even worse horrors. When Claudius died from a plate of poisoned mushrooms in 54 CE, few suspected that his 17-year-old stepson Nero would transform the imperial palace into a stage for the most psychologically twisted sexual dramas in Roman history. But then again, few understood the toxic relationship dynamics that had shaped Nero's development under the calculating influence of his mother, Agrippina the Younger, a woman who viewed incest as just another political tool and maternal authority as a license for sexual manipulation. Nero's reign would scandalize even a Roman society already desensitized to imperial excess, not just because of what he did, but because of how systematically he destroyed every boundary between family relationships, political authority, and sexual domination. For 14 years he turned the Roman Empire into his personal theater of sexual and psychological cruelty, with performances so grotesque that they challenged basic assumptions about human nature itself. The relationship between Nero and his mother Agrippina was a masterpiece of mutual sexual exploitation disguised as familial affection. According to multiple ancient sources, Agrippina initiated sexual contact with her teenage son as a way of maintaining political control over the new emperor, understanding that physical intimacy would give her leverage over imperial decisions that traditional maternal authority couldn't provide. But what began as Agrippina's calculated manipulation quickly evolved into something far more disturbing. Witnesses reported that whenever mother and son traveled together in the imperial litter, Nero's clothing would bear telltale stains that made their activities unmistakable to anyone who saw them emerge. These weren't discreet private encounters. They were semi-public displays of sexual dysfunction that forced the imperial court to pretend that obvious evidence of incest was somehow normal imperial behavior. The most chilling aspect was how both participants seemed to view their sexual relationship as a natural extension of political partnership. Agrippina didn't see herself as sexually abusing her son. She viewed physical intimacy as her rightful tool for exercising imperial influence. Nero didn't recognize his mother's behavior as predatory. He understood their sexual relationship as part of the complex dynamics of imperial power that he was expected to navigate and exploit. Contemporary accounts describe drinking sessions where Agrippina would deliberately intoxicate her son to make him more sexually compliant, while Nero learned to use their physical relationship to manipulate his mother's political decisions. They had created a feedback loop of mutual sexual exploitation where traditional concepts of family relationships, maternal authority, and filial respect became meaningless categories in the pursuit of political advantage. As Nero's reign progressed, his sexual appetites expanded beyond incest into increasingly elaborate and violent fantasies that combined theatrical performance with sadistic cruelty. His most notorious invention was a bizarre sex game where he would dress in animal pelts, emerge from a cage, and sexually assault men and women who had been tied to stakes around the arena, essentially creating live-action pornography that combined his love of theater with his appetite for sexual violence. The genius of these performances was how they implicated the entire imperial court in Nero's sexual crimes. Courtiers weren't just witnesses, they were required audience members whose attendance and applause made them accomplices in sexual assault. Palace guests understood that showing displeasure or attempting to leave during these performances could be interpreted as treason, forcing them to become enthusiastic spectators to rape and torture. The performances grew increasingly elaborate as Nero's appetite for novelty demanded constant escalation. What began as simple sexual assault evolved into complex theatrical productions featuring multiple victims, specialized equipment, and carefully choreographed scenarios that pushed the boundaries of what human beings could endure while maintaining the pretense of imperial entertainment. Perhaps Nero's most psychologically revealing relationships were his marriages to two different men, Pythagoras and Sporus, ceremonies that transformed homosexual relationships into grotesque parodies of traditional Roman marriage customs. These weren't casual same-sex affairs. They were elaborate theatrical productions designed to mock every conventional understanding of gender roles, family relationships, and social hierarchy. In his marriage to Pythagoras, Nero took the role of the bride, complete with wedding veil and traditional feminine submissiveness that shocked Roman society not because of the homosexual elements but because of how completely the emperor abandoned masculine authority in favor of performed femininity. The ceremony included all the traditional Roman wedding rituals, transformed into a public spectacle that forced the imperial court to treat sexual role play as legitimate state business. Even more disturbing was his relationship with Sporus, a young boy whom Nero had castrated specifically to make him more suitable as a wife. This wasn't just sexual abuse, it was a systematic program of physical and psychological destruction designed to transform a human being into a customized sexual object. Nero had Sporus surgically altered to better fulfill imperial fantasies, then paraded him in public as his legitimate spouse, forcing Roman society to accept mutilation and sexual slavery as expressions of imperial love. What made Nero's sexual crimes particularly devastating was how they systematically attacked every conventional understanding of healthy human relationships. He didn't just commit rape. He transformed rape into art. He didn't just practice incest, he made incest into policy. He didn't just engage in homosexual relationships, he turned same-sex attraction into a weapon for destroying gender identity and social hierarchy. The psychological impact extended far beyond the immediate victims to encompass the entire Roman political class, who were forced to witness, approve, and participate in sexual spectacles that violated every moral and social boundary they had been raised to respect. Nero created a court culture where survival required enthusiastic participation in sexual crimes, making every courtier complicit in the emperor's escalating depravity. When Nero's sexual experimentation combined with his theatrical ambitions, the results were performances that challenged the basic categories of human experience. He had transformed the Roman Empire into a stage where the boundaries between entertainment and torture, sexuality and violence, family relationships and political domination had completely dissolved. By 68 CE, even a society accustomed to imperial excess had reached its breaking point. Nero's sexual terrorism had finally provoked the rebellion that would end his reign and his life. But the precedents he had established, the techniques he had perfected, the boundaries he had destroyed, would inspire future emperors to even greater heights of creative depravity. The worst was still coming. Aulus Vitellius came to power during the chaotic year of the Four Emperors in 69 CE, and while his 8-month reign was brief, it was long enough to demonstrate that imperial sexual depravity could take forms that were somehow both comical and horrifying simultaneously. Described by contemporaries as abnormally tall, grotesquely fat, and perpetually drunk, Vitellius looked like a caricature of imperial excess, but his appearance masked a sexual predator whose appetites had been shaped by decades of strategic submission to more powerful perverts. The man who would briefly wear the purple had earned his political advancement through what can only be described as a career in sexual service, trading his body to a succession of emperors in exchange for political favor. But when Vitellius finally achieved power himself, he demonstrated that victims of sexual exploitation often become the most creative perpetrators, transforming their own trauma into elaborate systems for victimizing others. Vitellius's sexual education began in the worst possible school, Tiberius's island fortress of Capri, where he spent part of his childhood as the emperor's companion. During those formative years, young Vitellius acquired the nickname Tight Bum, a reference that needs no translation and speaks to experiences that would permanently warp his understanding of power relationships and sexual normalcy. But Vitellius wasn't just a victim on Capri. He was a student learning techniques of sexual manipulation and psychological control that he would later apply with devastating effect during his own brief reign. Under Tiberius's tutelage, he discovered how sexual submission could be weaponized for political advancement, how physical humiliation could create unbreakable bonds of mutual complicity, and how the threat of sexual violence could be more effective than violence itself for controlling potential opponents. The relationship with Tiberius wasn't casual abuse. It was a systematic apprenticeship in imperial sexual politics. Vitellius learned to read the subtle signs that indicated when powerful men were susceptible to sexual manipulation, how to position himself as simultaneously victim and accomplice, and most importantly, how to survive sexual exploitation by making himself indispensable to his abusers. After Tiberius's death, Vitellius seamlessly transitioned his sexual skills to serve subsequent emperors, demonstrating a remarkable talent for adapting his services to match each ruler's particular appetites and psychological needs. With Caligula, he learned to endure public humiliation as entertainment, surviving the emperor's habit of using imperial companions as props in elaborate sexual performances designed to shock and terrorize the court. The relationship with Caligula revealed new depths of Vitellius's adaptability. When the emperor decided to demonstrate his power by driving his chariot directly into Vitellius and crippling him for life, Vitellius not only survived the assault but somehow transformed his permanent injury into a mark of imperial favor that enhanced rather than diminished his political prospects. He had learned to weaponize victimhood itself, turning physical disability into proof of his loyalty and sexual service into evidence of his political reliability. Under Claudius, Vitellius discovered the political advantages of shared addiction, bonding with the emperor over their mutual love of gambling while providing sexual services that helped Claudius forget his humiliation at the hands of his nymphomaniac wife Messalina. Their relationship demonstrated how sexual exploitation could be disguised as friendship when both parties had complementary needs. The emperor's desire for sexual gratification and Vitellius's hunger for political advancement. When Vitellius finally achieved imperial power, his most significant relationship was with Asiaticus, a freedman whose meteoric rise through the imperial court was widely attributed to their sexual partnership. But this wasn't just another case of imperial favoritism. It was a sophisticated collaboration between two men who understood how sexual relationships could be systematically exploited for political and economic gain. Asiaticus wasn't merely Vitellius's lover. He was his business partner in an elaborate scheme to monetize imperial sexual access. Together they created what amounted to imperial escort service, where political favors, military appointments and economic privileges were traded for sexual services provided by carefully selected court members. They had transformed the traditional Roman practice of using sex for political advancement into a systematic commercial enterprise. The partnership revealed the logical endpoint of imperial sexual predation. When sexual exploitation becomes institutionalized, it inevitably evolves into a form of organized crime disguised as government administration. Vitellius and Asiaticus weren't just engaging in a homosexual relationship. They were operating a sexual trafficking network that used imperial authority to coerce participation and guarantee silence. What made Vitellius particularly disturbing was how his legendary gluttony intersected with his sexual appetites to create new forms of combined physical and sexual exploitation. His famous feasts weren't just displays of imperial excess, they were elaborate scenarios designed to combine food-based humiliation with sexual coercion, creating experiences that degraded victims on multiple levels simultaneously. Palace banquets under Vitellius featured entertainment that deliberately blurred the boundaries between feeding and sexual performance. Guests might be forced to consume excessive amounts of food and wine, while naked performers provided sexual entertainment, creating scenarios where physical discomfort, sexual arousal, and social humiliation combined into complex psychological torture that was somehow more devastating than any single form of abuse. The emperor himself would often participate in these performances while eating continuously, creating grotesque spectacles where imperial dignity, sexual violence, and disgusting consumption merged into displays that challenged observers' ability to process what they were witnessing. Vitellius had discovered that combining different forms of physical excess could create psychological impact that was greater than the sum of its parts. During his 8 months as emperor, Vitellius demonstrated that even the most debased sexual predator could find new ways to exploit imperial power for personal gratification. His court became a laboratory for experiments in combined physical and sexual abuse that pushed the boundaries of what human beings could endure while maintaining the pretense of imperial service. But Vitellius's reign also demonstrated the limits of sexual predation as a governing strategy. His obsession with personal gratification at the expense of military and political competence ultimately led to his downfall when Vespasian's armies arrived in Rome. The man who had spent decades perfecting the art of sexual survival through submission finally encountered a situation where his specialized skills were useless. When Vitellius was dragged through the streets of Rome with his hands bound and a noose around his neck, pelted with excrement and weight-related insults before being executed on the Gemonian stairs, his death marked the end of one of the most psychologically complex imperial careers in Roman history. He had been victim, perpetrator, survivor, and ultimately casualty of a system that treated human sexuality as just another tool of political control. Marcus Aurelius would later be remembered as the philosopher-emperor, but Domitian earned a very different kind of immortality as the ruler who treated sexual intercourse like gladiatorial combat and turned marital infidelity into a blood sport. For 15 years, he transformed the imperial palace into an arena where political loyalty was measured in sexual submission, and family relationships became weapons of mass psychological destruction. Domitian's approach to sexual predation was unique among the perverted emperors. He combined the systematic cruelty of Tiberius with the theatrical flair of Nero, but added his own innovation, the concept of sexual dominance as literal warfare. He didn't just rape his victims, he conquered them through what he proudly called bedroom wrestling, turning sexual assault into a form of imperial combat that required physical skill, strategic planning, and psychological domination. Domitian's infamous description of sexual intercourse as bedroom wrestling wasn't just colourful language, it reflected a genuinely disturbed worldview that treated intimate human relationships as competitive combat where victory required the complete physical and psychological subjugation of one's partner. This wasn't romantic metaphor or playful bedroom talk. It was a systematic approach to sexuality that treated consent as weakness and resistance as an enemy to be crushed through superior force and technique. The emperor maintained detailed records of his sexual victories, complete with performance notes that analyzed his techniques, scored his opponent's resistance levels, and tracked improvement in his ability to break down psychological defenses. Palace slaves were required to assist in these evaluations, functioning as sexual combat coaches who helped Domitian refine his approach to maximizing victim trauma while minimizing his own physical exertion. What made this particularly disturbing was how Domitian's wrestling metaphor influenced his selection of victims. He specifically targeted women who were known for their strength, intelligence, or independence, viewing their subjugation as more valuable trophies than the conquest of obviously vulnerable victims. The emperor wasn't just seeking sexual gratification, he was collecting victories over human dignity itself. Domitian's most notorious relationship was with his niece Julia Flavia, a liaison that combined incest with systematic psychological torture in ways that revealed the emperor's talent for transforming family relationships into instruments of sustained sexual terrorism. But this wasn't just forbidden romance or even straightforward sexual abuse. It was a calculated campaign to destroy a woman's identity through the systematic exploitation of familial trust and authority. The relationship began when Julia was still married to another man, but Domitian used his imperial authority to essentially kidnap her from her husband and install her as his unofficial concubine. This wasn't a discreet affair, it was a public humiliation designed to demonstrate that imperial sexual desires superseded any competing claims of marriage, family loyalty, or personal autonomy. What made the abuse particularly cruel was how Domitian manipulated Julia's family relationships to maximize her psychological isolation. He forced her to participate in sexual acts during family gatherings, making her complicit in her own humiliation while ensuring that her relatives became unwilling witnesses to her degradation. The emperor had weaponized family dinners, turning them into performances where Julia was required to demonstrate her sexual submission in front of the people who should have been protecting her. The pregnancy that resulted from this abuse became another opportunity for psychological torture. When Julia became inconveniently pregnant with Domitian's child, he forced her to undergo an abortion that was deliberately performed without proper medical care, essentially murdering both the child and Julia herself through medical negligence that was clearly intentional. The emperor had discovered that killing his victims through botched abortions provided the same sexual satisfaction as direct murder while maintaining plausible deniability about his intentions. Perhaps Domitian's most psychologically disturbing innovation was his practice of personally removing body hair from his sexual victims using his own hands, a ritual that combined physical intimacy with systematic humiliation in ways that challenged basic categories of human experience. This wasn't just personal grooming or even sexual preparation, it was a form of psychological torture that used the pretense of intimate care to establish complete physical and emotional dominance. The process was deliberately prolonged and conducted in front of audiences that included palace staff, political officials, and sometimes the victim's own family members. Domitian would spend hours methodically removing every hair from a woman's body while providing detailed commentary on her physical attributes, sexual potential, and psychological responses to the experience. The ritual transformed personal hygiene into public degradation, intimate touch into invasive assault, and physical beauty into evidence of sexual availability. What made this particularly effective as psychological torture was how it forced victims to remain motionless and cooperative during an experience that was simultaneously intimate and violating. Women who resisted or showed displeasure faced escalating physical violence, while those who submitted were required to express gratitude for the emperor's personal attention to their grooming needs. Domitian had created a perfect trap where resistance led to brutality and compliance led to complicity in their own humiliation. Domitian's pool parties at the imperial baths became legendary for their combination of public spectacle and private degradation, featuring elaborate scenarios where aristocratic women were forced to swim naked alongside common prostitutes, while the emperor evaluated their comparative sexual appeal and performance potential. These weren't casual social gatherings, they were carefully orchestrated competitions designed to destroy class distinctions through shared sexual humiliation. The emperor would position himself as judge in these aquatic beauty contests, providing detailed scores and commentary on each participant's physical attributes, swimming technique, and sexual attractiveness. But the real purpose wasn't entertainment. It was psychological warfare designed to demonstrate that imperial authority could reduce any woman, regardless of birth or status, to the level of commercial sexual commodity. The aftermath of these parties was often more traumatic than the events themselves. Women who had been forced to compete were required to socialize normally with the prostitutes who had outperformed them, creating ongoing relationships based on shared humiliation and competitive sexual degradation. Domitian had created a social system where survival required enthusiastic participation in one's own debasement, while maintaining friendships with the people who had witnessed and participated in that debasement. When Domitian was finally assassinated in 96 CE, his death ended one of the most psychologically sophisticated programs of sexual terrorism in imperial history. But his innovations, the wrestling philosophy, the family destruction techniques, the systematic use of physical intimacy for psychological torture, would influence future emperors and create new possibilities for imperial sexual predation that pushed the boundaries of human cruelty into previously unexplored territory. When the 14-year-old Syrian priest Marcus Aurelius Antoninus Augustus became emperor in 218 CE, taking the name Elagabalus after his patron deity, Rome thought it was getting an exotic young ruler who might bring fresh energy to the imperial office. What they got instead was a gender-fluid sexual revolutionary who spent 4 years systematically destroying every Roman concept of masculinity, political dignity, and sexual normalcy through performances so outrageous that even hardened Roman audiences struggled to process what they were witnessing. Elagabalus didn't just break sexual boundaries, he obliterated them, creating new categories of imperial perversion that combined religious extremism with psychological experimentation in ways that challenged basic assumptions about gender identity, sexual orientation, and the nature of power itself. His reign was a sustained assault on Roman sexual culture disguised as religious reform and political innovation. Elagabalus's most audacious project was transforming the Roman Forum, the sacred heart of republican government and imperial administration, into an open-air brothel where state business was conducted alongside commercial sexual transactions. This wasn't just symbolic desecration. It was a systematic program to merge political authority with sexual commerce in ways that made governance indistinguishable from prostitution. The emperor established official prices for various sexual services and required senators to conduct political negotiations in the same spaces where prostitutes serviced their clients. Foreign ambassadors found themselves negotiating treaties while surrounded by ongoing sexual transactions, creating diplomatic scenarios that forced international representatives to pretend that conducting state business in a brothel was somehow normal imperial protocol. But Elagabalus wasn't content to merely oversee this sexual marketplace. He actively participated as both customer and provider, personally servicing clients while wearing imperial regalia that made his prostitution into a form of state ceremony. Roman citizens could literally purchase sexual services from their emperor, creating transactions that combined commercial sex with religious worship and political submission in ways that defied every category of normal human experience. Perhaps Elagabalus's most notorious innovation was his practice of selecting government officials based exclusively on the size of their genitalia, creating what amounted to a penis-based meritocracy that replaced traditional qualifications with anatomical measurements. This wasn't just sexual preference influencing political decisions, it was a systematic program to reorganize imperial administration around sexual criteria rather than competence, experience, or loyalty. The selection process was conducted through elaborate ceremonies where potential appointees were required to display themselves naked before the emperor and his evaluation committee, which included court physicians who provided professional measurements and performance assessments. These weren't private auditions, they were public spectacles where political advancement was determined through sexual performance rather than administrative capability. Officials appointed through this system were required to maintain their physical qualifications through regular re-evaluations that combined job performance reviews with sexual performance assessments. Government meetings included mandatory nudity requirements that ensured ongoing verification of anatomical credentials, creating an administrative system where political authority was literally embodied in sexual characteristics. What made Elagabalus truly revolutionary was his systematic exploration of gender identity through surgical experimentation that pushed the boundaries of ancient medical technology. According to multiple sources, he offered enormous financial rewards to physicians who could create female genitalia through surgical intervention, essentially attempting to become Rome's first transgender emperor through primitive sex reassignment procedures. This wasn't casual cross-dressing or theatrical performance, it was a sustained medical experiment designed to physically transform the emperor's body to match his psychological gender identity. Palace physicians were required to research surgical techniques for genital reconstruction, creating what amounted to the ancient world's first gender reassignment program, complete with experimental procedures and ongoing medical monitoring. The emperor's gender experimentation extended beyond surgery to include elaborate social rituals where he adopted complete female identity, including feminine clothing, makeup, and behavioral patterns that required court officials to interact with him as a woman rather than acknowledging his biological sex or imperial status. These weren't occasional costume parties, they were systematic attempts to live as a different gender while maintaining imperial authority. Elagabalus's approach to marriage combined his gender experimentation with religious innovation to create ceremonial unions that challenged every Roman concept of legitimate relationships. His marriage to the Vestal Virgin Aquilia Severa wasn't just politically scandalous, it was a systematic assault on religious tradition that used sexual transgression as a tool for restructuring imperial theology. But this was only the beginning of his marital experimentation. The emperor conducted multiple marriage ceremonies with both men and women, sometimes simultaneously, creating complex polyamorous arrangements that required new legal categories and ceremonial protocols. His marriage to the charioteer Hargros included elaborate public ceremonies where Elagabalus adopted the role of submissive wife, complete with traditional feminine wedding attire and domestic responsibilities. These marriages weren't just personal relationships, they were political statements designed to demonstrate that imperial authority could redefine fundamental social institutions through sheer force of will. Elagabalus was using marriage as a weapon against traditional Roman values, creating new forms of legitimate relationships that incorporated homosexuality, polyamory, and gender fluidity into official state institutions. What made Elagabalus particularly dangerous was how his sexual experimentation combined with genuine political competence to create reforms that outlasted his personal scandals. While Roman audiences were horrified by his gender performances and sexual innovations, many of his administrative policies were actually effective improvements to imperial governance that demonstrated real political intelligence behind the sexual theatrics. This combination of competence and controversy made Elagabalus impossible to dismiss as simply a perverted incompetent. His sexual revolution was backed by genuine political skill that forced Romans to confront the possibility that effective governance might be compatible with complete sexual degeneracy, a realization that challenged basic assumptions about the relationship between personal morality and political authority. When Elagabalus was finally murdered by his own Praetorian Guard in 222 CE, his death ended one of the most psychologically complex imperial careers in Roman history. But his innovations, the integration of sexuality and governance, the exploration of gender fluidity, the systematic challenge to sexual norms, had permanently expanded the boundaries of what future emperors might attempt in their own pursuit of ultimate sexual and political authority. The boy who had tried to become a woman had shown Rome new possibilities for imperial perversion that would inspire and terrify future generations of sexual predators wearing purple. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor, spent his final years desperately trying to prepare his son Commodus for the responsibilities of imperial power. But what the Stoic father couldn't foresee was that his heir would transform the Colosseum into his personal sexual playground and turn gladiatorial combat into an elaborate form of foreplay that combined blood sport with sexual exhibition in ways that horrified even Romans accustomed to imperial excess. For 12 years, Commodus ruled an empire while living out fantasies that merged his obsession with gladiatorial combat with sexual appetites that grew increasingly violent and exhibitionist. He didn't just watch gladiators fight, he participated in rigged matches while using the arena as a stage for sexual performances that turned public entertainment into imperial pornography witnessed by thousands of terrified spectators. Commodus's innovation was recognizing that the gladiatorial arena provided the perfect venue for combining his two primary obsessions, physical dominance and sexual exhibition. Unlike his predecessors who confined their sexual crimes to palace chambers, Commodus moved his performances into public spaces where tens of thousands of Romans were forced to witness imperial sexual violence disguised as athletic entertainment. His gladiatorial matches weren't genuine competitions, they were elaborate theatrical productions where carefully selected opponents were required to participate in scenarios that combined combat with increasingly explicit sexual content. Gladiators understood that their survival depended not just on fighting skill but on their willingness to participate in sexual performances that satisfied the emperor's escalating appetite for public validation of his sexual dominance. The emperor would enter the arena wearing modified gladiatorial equipment that was designed more for sexual access than combat protection, creating costumes that allowed him to transition seamlessly from fighting to sexual assault while maintaining the pretense that spectators were witnessing legitimate athletic competition. The crowd was forced to cheer for performances that combined sport with rape, creating mass complicity in sexual crimes through the manipulation of traditional entertainment expectations. Commodus developed what amounted to a specialized breeding program for gladiators who would serve dual roles as combat performers and sexual partners, creating a unique category of imperial slave whose job description included both fighting skills and sexual availability. This wasn't just casual exploitation of gladiator vulnerability, it was a systematic program designed to produce custom sexual partners who combined physical strength with complete psychological submission. The selection process involved elaborate competitions where potential candidates were evaluated on both combat ability and sexual performance, with successful applicants receiving specialized training that prepared them for the complex demands of serving as the emperor's arena partners. These men lived in luxury comparable to palace courtiers while understanding that their continued survival depended on their ability to satisfy Commodus's evolving sexual and competitive needs. What made this system particularly disturbing was how it normalized sexual slavery through the glamour of gladiatorial fame. These men weren't just sex slaves, they were celebrity athletes whose public success made their private sexual exploitation seem like privilege rather than abuse. Commodus had discovered how to use social status and public recognition to disguise systematic rape as career advancement. Perhaps Commodus's most psychologically complex innovation was his creation of female gladiator units that he personally trained and commanded. Ostensibly for combat purposes but actually as elaborate scenarios for sexual domination that combined his fantasies of military leadership with his appetite for controlling women through violence and intimidation. These Amazon units were composed of women selected for their physical strength and fighting potential, but their training regimens included sexual instruction designed to prepare them for intimate service to the emperor when their combat duties were complete. The combination of warrior training and sexual preparation created psychological conflicts that broke down the women's resistance while making them complicit in their own exploitation. The emperor would lead these female units in carefully choreographed battles against male opponents, creating public spectacles where gender conflict was literalized through combat while providing opportunities for Commodus to demonstrate his sexual dominance over women who had proven their physical capabilities. The message was clear: even the strongest women were ultimately subject to imperial sexual authority. Commodus's most notorious arena performances involved combat with wild animals that he somehow transformed into sexual exhibitions, creating scenarios where the emperor's domination of dangerous beasts became metaphors for his sexual conquests while providing increasingly extreme stimulation for his exhibitionist appetites. The preparation for these events included elaborate rituals where Commodus would work himself into sexual arousal through increasingly violent encounters with captured animals, using the adrenaline and physical danger of beast fighting as a form of foreplay that enhanced his subsequent sexual performances with human partners. The emperor had discovered that the proximity of death enhanced sexual pleasure, creating feedback loops that required increasingly extreme risks to achieve the same level of stimulation. Spectators were forced to witness these combinations of animal violence and human sexuality while maintaining the pretense that they were enjoying traditional gladiatorial entertainment. The psychological impact was devastating. Tens of thousands of Romans were implicated in sexual crimes through their presence at events that used public entertainment to normalize imperial sexual violence. When Commodus wasn't performing in the Colosseum, he was hosting elaborate palace orgies that incorporated gladiatorial themes into private sexual entertainment, creating indoor arenas where invited guests were forced to participate in combat-themed sexual scenarios that combined his love of fighting with his appetite for group sexual humiliation. These events featured specialized equipment that allowed participants to engage in mock combat while performing sexual acts, creating entertainment that was simultaneously athletic competition and pornographic performance. Guests understood that their political survival depended on enthusiastic participation in these events, regardless of their personal comfort with the activities involved. The emperor would personally direct these performances, functioning as both participant and choreographer in sexual scenarios that grew increasingly elaborate and violent as his appetite for novelty demanded constant escalation. What began as themed costume parties evolved into systematic sexual torture disguised as recreational entertainment. When Commodus was finally strangled in his bath by the wrestler Narcissus in 192 CE, his death ended 12 years of imperial rule that had transformed public entertainment into mass sexual trauma. But his innovations, the combination of sport and sexuality, the use of public venues for private gratification, the systematization of sexual slavery through athletic competition, had created new possibilities for imperial perversion that would influence future emperors and forever change the relationship between political power and sexual exhibition. The arena had been his stage, and the entire Roman Empire had been forced to watch the show. When Marcus Aurelius Severus Antoninus Augustus earned the nickname Caracalla from the hooded Gallic cloak he popularized, few suspected that beneath the fashionable exterior lurked one of Rome's most sexually violent emperors, a man who would spend 6 years transforming imperial power into a weapon for systematic sexual terrorism that made his predecessors' depravities seem almost quaint by comparison. His reign wasn't just politically brutal. It was a sustained campaign of sexual violence that used family relationships, military authority, and religious symbolism as tools for psychological warfare against anyone who dared to exist within his reach. Caracalla's approach to sexual predation was unique among the perverted emperors. He combined genuine military competence with psychopathic sexual violence, creating a ruler who could effectively manage complex military campaigns while simultaneously operating the most sophisticated sexual torture network in imperial history. He didn't just abuse his power for sexual gratification. He weaponized sexuality itself as a form of political terrorism that kept potential opponents paralyzed through fear of what he might do to their families. Caracalla's sexual career began with the systematic psychological destruction of his younger brother Geta, a campaign that included the calculated seduction and sexual humiliation of Geta's wife as a form of psychological warfare designed to break his brother's spirit before eventually murdering him outright. This wasn't sibling rivalry or political competition. It was a deliberate program of family destruction that used sexual violence as the primary weapon for establishing dominance within the imperial household. The seduction of Geta's wife wasn't romantic conquest or even casual adultery. It was strategic sexual assault designed to demonstrate that no relationship, no matter how sacred or legally protected, was safe from Caracalla's appetites. The emperor made sure that Geta knew exactly what was happening, arranging for the brother to discover the affair in ways that maximized his humiliation while making clear that resistance would only lead to escalated suffering. What made this particularly cruel was how Caracalla used the sexual relationship to manipulate family dynamics, forcing Geta's wife to choose between protecting her husband through compliance or protecting herself through resistance. The emperor had created a perfect trap where every possible response led to increased suffering for someone within the family unit, making the victims complicit in each other's destruction while ensuring that no outcome provided genuine relief from imperial sexual terrorism. As a genuinely competent military commander, Caracalla understood how to exploit the hierarchical nature of Roman military culture to create systematic opportunities for sexual predation that used military discipline as cover for organized sexual crimes. His innovation was recognizing that military authority could be used to legitimize sexual violence by framing rape as military discipline and resistance as insubordination that threatened imperial security. The emperor developed elaborate protocols for inspecting the wives and daughters of military officers, creating official procedures that required family members to submit to imperial examination under the pretense of ensuring their moral fitness for association with the imperial army. These inspections were actually systematic sexual assaults disguised as military administration, but the formal protocols made resistance seem like defiance of legitimate military authority rather than justified self-defense. Caracalla's military sexual network extended throughout the empire's frontier regions, where his frequent campaigns provided endless opportunities to exploit local populations while using military necessity as justification for sexual crimes that would have been obviously criminal in civilian contexts. The emperor had discovered that war zones provided perfect cover for sexual predation, since conquered populations had no legal recourse and military personnel were trained to follow orders without questioning their moral implications. Perhaps Caracalla's most audacious innovation was his transformation of the massive public bath complex that bears his name into a venue for imperial sexual performances that forced thousands of Romans to witness sexual violence while pretending to enjoy recreational bathing. The baths of Caracalla weren't just architectural monuments, they were carefully designed theatres for sexual exhibition that normalized imperial predation through mass public exposure. The emperor would stage elaborate sexual performances in the main bathing areas, using the pretense of imperial leisure activities to create scenarios where resistance was impossible and avoidance was treasonous. Citizens who came to the baths for legitimate recreational purposes found themselves trapped as involuntary audiences for sexual crimes, creating mass complicity through simple physical presence in imperial facilities. What made this particularly effective as psychological terrorism was how it weaponized public space against the Roman population, transforming recreational facilities that should have been safe community gathering places into potential venues for witnessing imperial sexual violence. Caracalla had made it impossible for Romans to use public facilities without risking forced participation in sexual crimes, creating a climate of fear that extended imperial sexual authority into every aspect of daily life. Caracalla's most psychologically disturbing innovation was his integration of sexual violence into religious ceremonies, creating ritual contexts where rape became a form of religious sacrifice that combined imperial authority with divine sanction in ways that made resistance seem not just politically dangerous but religiously blasphemous. His performances weren't just sexual crimes, they were sacred acts that used religious symbolism to legitimize sexual violence. The emperor would conduct these religious sexual ceremonies in major temples throughout the empire, forcing local populations to witness sexual violence while maintaining the pretense that they were participating in legitimate religious observances. Priests were required to bless sexual assaults as offerings to the gods, creating religious complicity in imperial sexual crimes that made the entire Roman religious establishment accomplices in systematic sexual terrorism. The psychological impact was devastating. Victims couldn't seek religious consolation for their suffering, because the religious authorities had blessed their abuse as divine will. Communities couldn't condemn imperial sexual violence because their own priests had participated in its religious justification. Caracolla had weaponized religious authority to create psychological trauma that extended far beyond the immediate victims to encompass entire communities forced to watch their sacred institutions participate in their own degradation. When Caracolla was finally assassinated in 217 CE, his death ended 6 years of imperial rule that had transformed sexual violence from a personal vice into a systematic instrument of political control that affected every level of Roman society. But his innovations, the weaponization of family relationships, the militarization of sexual predation, the sacralization of sexual violence, had created new possibilities for imperial perversion that would influence future emperors and permanently alter the relationship between political authority and sexual terrorism. Caracolla had shown that sexual violence could be used not just for personal gratification, but as a tool for governing through fear, creating imperial authority that extended into the most intimate aspects of human relationships, while using religious and military institutions to legitimize crimes that should have been universally condemned. The emperor was dead, but the system he had created lived on, ready to inspire even worse horrors in the hands of successors who understood the political power of systematic sexual terrorism. By the 3rd century CE, the Roman Empire had perfected something far more sophisticated than individual sexual predation. It had created an institutional framework for systematically erasing imperial crimes from historical memory, while simultaneously enabling future emperors to commit even worse atrocities. This wasn't just casual historical revisionism, it was an organized conspiracy involving historians, artists, architects, and entire government bureaucracies dedicated to transforming sexual terrorism into imperial virtue through the systematic manipulation of truth itself. The cover-up machine didn't just hide individual crimes, it reconstructed reality itself, creating alternative histories where perverted emperors became moral exemplars and sexual predators were transformed into defenders of traditional values. This process was so thorough and so successful that for centuries even scholars who suspected the truth lacked the evidence to challenge official narratives that had been carefully scrubbed clean of inconvenient facts. The Roman practice of damnatio memoria, the damnation of memory, wasn't just about destroying statues or defacing coins. It was a comprehensive program for rewriting history that involved armies of craftsmen, scribes, and artists working systematically to eliminate every trace of imperial sexual crimes from the physical and literary record. This process was so thorough that in many cases we only know about imperial atrocities because the cover-up efforts were incomplete, or because political enemies preserved evidence for future revenge. The protocol began immediately after an emperor's death or overthrow, with specialized teams dispatched throughout the empire to identify and destroy evidence of sexual crimes. Statues were recarved with different faces, turning monuments to sexual predators into celebrations of their successors. Inscriptions were chiseled away and replaced with fabricated accounts of moral virtue and political competence. Even private correspondence was systematically hunted down and destroyed, eliminating personal accounts that might contradict official narratives. But the most insidious aspect was how the protocol extended beyond simple destruction to active reconstruction of historical truth. Artists were commissioned to create new artworks that depicted perverted emperors as moral exemplars, complete with fabricated scenes of family virtue and religious devotion. Historians were required to produce official biographies that transformed sexual predators into defenders of traditional Roman values, creating literary works that were technically accurate about political events while completely falsifying the personal character of their subjects. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the cover-up machine was how enthusiastically the Roman Senate participated in erasing crimes they had witnessed and often facilitated. The same senators who had watched emperors rape their wives and daughters became the most vocal advocates for historical revisionism that portrayed those emperors as moral leaders deserving posthumous respect and admiration. This complicity wasn't born from fear alone. It emerged from a collective understanding that acknowledging imperial sexual crimes would require confronting the senators' own role as enablers and accomplices. If they admitted that emperors were sexual predators, they would have to explain why they had provided victims, facilitated crimes, and remained silent during decades of systematic sexual terrorism. It was easier to rewrite history than to accept responsibility for their own moral cowardice. The senators developed sophisticated techniques for collaborative amnesia, creating shared narratives that transformed their own victimization into evidence of imperial greatness. Families whose members had been sexually abused by emperors became the loudest advocates for those emperors' historical reputations, understanding that their own social standing depended on maintaining the fiction that imperial attention had been honor rather than trauma. The Roman imperial bureaucracy developed standardized procedures for transforming sexual crimes into administrative victories, creating official documentation that recorded systematic sexual predation as evidence of successful governance and effective leadership. Palace records that originally documented sexual assaults were revised to describe diplomatic negotiations. Accounts of sexual torture were rewritten as descriptions of religious ceremonies. Inventories of sexual slaves were transformed into lists of honored court attendees. This bureaucratic sanitization wasn't just about hiding crimes, it was about actively reconstructing them as virtues that demonstrated imperial competence and moral authority. Government scribes developed specialized vocabularies for describing sexual violence in ways that made it sound like political achievement, creating linguistic frameworks that could transform any atrocity into evidence of successful leadership. The process was so systematic that future historians studying imperial records would find consistent evidence of moral virtue and political competence, even in the reigns of emperors who had spent their entire careers committing sexual crimes. The bureaucracy had literally rewritten reality, creating documentary evidence that supported historical narratives they knew to be completely false. Perhaps the most audacious aspect of the cover-up machine was how it used religious authority to legitimize the historical reputations of emperors, whose sexual crimes had included systematic attacks on religious institutions and personnel. Priests who had been forced to participate in imperial sexual violence became advocates for posthumous imperial canonization, creating religious narratives that portrayed sexual predators as defenders of traditional Roman religion and moral values. This religious rehabilitation involved the systematic reinterpretation of imperial sexual crimes as expressions of divine authority and religious devotion. Sexual violence against religious personnel was reframed as tests of faith. The rape of Vestal virgins was described as mystical religious experiences. The use of temples for sexual torture was presented as innovative forms of religious ceremony that demonstrated imperial piety and theological sophistication. The priests who participated in this rehabilitation understood that their own survival depended on maintaining these fabricated narratives, since acknowledging the truth about imperial sexual crimes would require admitting their own complicity in systematic religious corruption. They became some of the most effective advocates for historical revisionism, using religious authority to sanctify lies that protected both imperial reputations and their own careers. Roman artists and architects played crucial roles in the cover-up machine, creating visual narratives that contradicted everything they had witnessed while living through the reigns of sexually predatory emperors. The same craftsmen who had decorated imperial palaces with pornographic imagery, designed to facilitate sexual violence, were commissioned to create public monuments celebrating those emperors as moral exemplars and family men. This artistic propaganda was particularly effective because it created lasting visual evidence that supported fabricated historical narratives while eliminating physical traces of imperial sexual crimes. Palaces that had been designed as sexual torture facilities were renovated into monuments to imperial virtue. Artwork that had depicted sexual violence was replaced with scenes of family harmony and religious devotion. Architectural spaces that had been created for sexual predation were transformed into symbols of imperial moral authority. The artists who participated in this transformation understood that their own survival depended on enthusiastic participation in historical falsification, but they also discovered opportunities for creative revenge through subtle symbolic elements that preserved coded references to imperial sexual crimes for viewers sophisticated enough to decode them. The cover-up machine was comprehensive but not perfect, and some traces of truth survived in artistic details that future scholars would eventually recognize as evidence of systematic historical manipulation. The machine was running perfectly, ready to sanitize whatever fresh horrors the next generation of perverted emperors might devise. The most devastating aspect of Rome's systematic sexual terrorism wasn't what the emperors did to their direct victims. It was what the imperial system did to the millions of Romans who were forced to witness, enable, and celebrate sexual crimes while maintaining the fiction that they lived in a civilized society governed by moral principles. For centuries, the Roman Empire functioned as a massive psychological experiment in collective trauma, where entire populations were systematically desensitized to sexual violence through forced participation in imperial depravity. This wasn't just political oppression or even ordinary tyranny, it was a form of mass psychological manipulation that used sexual violence as a tool for breaking down the moral resistance of an entire civilization. The emperors weren't just seeking personal gratification. They were conducting a systematic campaign to transform Roman society into a population of willing accomplices who would enthusiastically participate in their own moral destruction. Perhaps the most psychologically destructive aspect of imperial sexual predation was how it forced ordinary Romans to become involuntary witnesses to sexual crimes they were powerless to prevent or escape. Citizens attending gladiatorial games found themselves watching sexual violence disguised as entertainment. Families invited to imperial banquets discovered they were required to witness the rape of their own relatives. Religious worshippers attending temple ceremonies were trapped as audiences for sexual torture presented as divine ritual. The psychological impact of forced spectatorship was devastating and long-lasting. Witnesses to imperial sexual crimes experienced a form of moral injury that combined personal trauma with collective guilt, creating psychological damage that extended far beyond the immediate victims to encompass entire communities forced to watch crimes they couldn't prevent or acknowledge. The emperor had weaponized the basic human capacity for empathy, turning natural emotional responses into sources of ongoing psychological torture. What made this particularly effective was how the imperial system made resistance impossible while ensuring that silence felt like complicity. Romans who witnessed sexual violence couldn't speak about their experiences without risking their own destruction, but their enforced silence made them feel like accomplices in crimes they had desperately wanted to prevent. The emperors had created a perfect psychological trap where victims, witnesses, and society itself became collaborators in systematic sexual terrorism. The Roman aristocracy developed what can only be described as a collective form of Stockholm syndrome, where families whose members had been sexually terrorized by emperors became the most vocal advocates for those emperors' historical reputations and political achievements. This wasn't just fear-based compliance, it was a genuine psychological adaptation that transformed trauma into loyalty and sexual victimization into evidence of imperial favor. Aristocratic families learned to compete for imperial sexual attention, understanding that having their wives and daughters abused by emperors was actually a mark of political importance that enhanced rather than diminished their social status. They developed elaborate protocols for preparing family members for sexual service to imperial power, creating training programs that disguised sexual trafficking as social education and family duty. The most disturbing aspect was how these families genuinely convinced themselves that imperial sexual attention was an honor rather than an assault. They created family narratives that reframed sexual violence as political opportunity and interpreted ongoing trauma as evidence of continuing imperial favor. The aristocracy had learned to love their own destruction, transforming systematic sexual abuse into a competitive advantage that they pursued with genuine enthusiasm. The Roman military, supposedly the guardian of imperial virtue and Roman values, became the primary enforcement mechanism for imperial sexual terrorism while maintaining the fiction that they were protecting rather than enabling systematic sexual violence. Soldiers who had sworn oaths to defend Roman citizens found themselves tasked with facilitating imperial sexual crimes, creating institutional conflicts that destroyed military morale while corrupting the basic moral foundations of imperial defense. Military units were regularly assigned to capture victims for imperial sexual entertainment, transport sexual slaves between imperial residences, and provide security for sexual torture sessions that violated every principle of military honor and Roman justice. The same soldiers who fought bravely against foreign enemies were required to participate in systematic sexual crimes against their own citizens, creating psychological contradictions that broke down military cohesion while corrupting the institutional culture that held the empire together. The most devastating impact was on military leadership, where officers who had achieved their positions through legitimate merit and genuine heroism found themselves managing logistics for imperial sexual predation, while maintaining command authority over troops who understood exactly what they were being asked to facilitate. The military hierarchy became a system for organizing sexual crimes rather than defending imperial security, transforming heroic institutions into criminal enterprises that operated under the cover of military discipline. Perhaps the most psychologically damaging aspect of imperial sexual terrorism was how it systematically corrupted Roman religious institutions, forcing priests and religious authorities to bless sexual violence as divine will, while maintaining their roles as moral leaders and spiritual guides for traumatized populations. The same religious figures who should have been providing moral guidance and spiritual comfort to victims instead became accomplices in their sexual abuse. Religious personnel were required to participate in ceremonies where sexual violence was presented as religious ritual, creating theological frameworks that transformed imperial sexual crimes into expressions of divine authority and religious devotion. Priests who had dedicated their lives to serving the gods found themselves blessing sexual torture as sacred ceremony, creating spiritual conflicts that destroyed their capacity for authentic religious leadership, while corrupting the institutions that should have provided moral resistance to imperial depravity. The psychological impact extended throughout Roman society, where citizens who sought religious consolation for trauma caused by imperial sexual violence discovered that their own priests had participated in legitimizing those crimes as divine will. The religious corruption eliminated any possibility of spiritual healing or moral clarity, creating populations trapped between ongoing trauma and corrupted religious institutions that offered false comfort while perpetuating the very systems that had caused their suffering. The most lasting damage from centuries of imperial sexual terrorism was how it created intergenerational patterns of trauma and moral corruption that were passed down through Roman families like genetic inheritance. Children raised in households where imperial sexual violence was normalized as political necessity developed psychological frameworks that prepared them to either perpetrate or enable similar crimes when they achieved positions of authority. Roman society had become a machine for manufacturing sexual predators and their enablers, creating cultural patterns that ensured the continuation of imperial sexual terrorism regardless of which individual emperor held power. The system had become self-perpetuating, producing generation after generation of Romans who understood that survival required enthusiastic participation in sexual violence while maintaining the fiction that they lived in a moral civilization. When the Western Roman Empire finally collapsed in the 5th century, one of the unrecognized factors in its decline was the psychological exhaustion of populations who had spent centuries participating in their own moral destruction while maintaining the fiction that they were citizens of a civilized society. The empire had literally corrupted itself to death, creating social structures so psychologically toxic that they could no longer sustain the basic human cooperation necessary for political survival. The sexual terrorism had succeeded beyond the emperor's wildest dreams, but the price was the destruction of the civilization they had sought to dominate. What makes the story of Rome's perverted emperors even more chilling is how much physical evidence survived despite centuries of systematic cover-up efforts. Hidden beneath layers of marble renovation, buried in forgotten storage rooms and preserved in the ruins of imperial palaces, archaeologists have discovered a treasure trove of artifacts that reveal the true scope of imperial sexual predation. Evidence so disturbing that much of it remains locked away in museum storage facilities, deemed too graphic for public display. Recent excavations beneath the Palatine Hill have uncovered elaborate underground chambers that were clearly designed for sexual torture and entertainment, complete with specialized restraint systems, drainage channels for bodily fluids, and viewing galleries that allowed audiences to watch imperial sexual violence without being seen by the victims. These weren't improvised spaces. They were professionally designed facilities that represented significant architectural investments in systematic sexual predation. The most disturbing discoveries were the children's quarters adjacent to these torture chambers, small rooms equipped with beds, toys, and educational materials that suggest long-term imprisonment of juvenile victims. Archaeological evidence indicates these spaces were continuously occupied for decades, revealing that imperial pedophilia wasn't occasional criminal behavior but a sustained institutional program that required permanent facilities and specialized staff. Medical instruments discovered in these chambers include primitive surgical tools apparently designed for sexual modification of victims, suggesting that imperial sexual experimentation included permanent physical alterations that went far beyond anything described in historical sources. The emperors weren't just abusing their victims, they were conducting medical experiments that combined sexual torture with primitive surgical procedures. Hidden frescoes discovered during palace renovations reveal artistic programs that depicted imperial sexual crimes with documentary precision, creating visual records that functioned as both pornographic entertainment and historical documentation of specific incidents. These aren't stylized artistic interpretations, they're realistic depictions of recognizable historical figures engaged in specific sexual acts that correlate with written accounts of imperial behavior. The most significant discovery was a series of mosaic portraits that appear to commemorate specific victims of imperial sexual violence, creating what amounts to a trophy gallery that celebrated successful sexual conquests with the same artistic treatment typically reserved for military victories. The emperors had commissioned permanent artistic monuments to their sexual crimes, treating rape and torture as achievements worthy of commemorative art. Perhaps most disturbing are the human remains discovered in imperial burial sites, which show evidence of sexual trauma so severe that it left permanent marks on skeletal remains. Forensic analysis reveals patterns of bone damage consistent with prolonged sexual torture, while DNA evidence suggests systematic breeding programs designed to produce children for imperial sexual exploitation. Medical analysis of imperial mummies has revealed evidence that several emperors suffered from sexually transmitted diseases that were clearly acquired through contact with multiple unwilling partners, providing biological proof of the sexual predation described in historical sources. The emperor's own bodies became evidence of their crimes, preserving proof of systematic sexual violence in their very bones and tissues. Excavations of imperial administrative buildings have uncovered extensive record-keeping systems that documented sexual slavery with the same bureaucratic precision used for tax collection and military recruitment. These archives include detailed inventories of sexual slaves, performance evaluations of imperial partners, and correspondence between different imperial residences, coordinating the transport and training of victims. The discovery of these administrative records has revealed that imperial sexual predation operated as a formal government function with specialized departments, professional staff, and standardized procedures. The Romans had literally bureaucratized sexual slavery, creating institutional frameworks that treated human trafficking as routine imperial administration. Construction contracts discovered in these archives detail the specifications for sexual torture facilities, revealing that imperial sexual violence required the services of architects, engineers, and craftsmen who specialized in designing spaces for systematic sexual abuse. The emperors had created entire industries devoted to facilitating sexual crimes, corrupting Roman commerce and craftsmanship in service of imperial depravity. The stones themselves remember what Rome tried to forget. The horrors of imperial Rome weren't unique products of ancient barbarity. They were predictable outcomes of institutional structures that concentrated absolute power while eliminating accountability mechanisms. The same dynamics that transformed Roman emperors into sexual predators operate in every society where power becomes disconnected from consequences, making this ancient history devastatingly relevant to understanding modern patterns of systematic sexual abuse by powerful elites. The Roman imperial system created what modern psychologists would recognize as an institutional framework for manufacturing sexual predators through systematic desensitization, isolation from consequences, and the gradual normalization of increasingly extreme behavior. This pattern isn't historically unique. It reappears wherever institutions prioritize protecting powerful individuals over protecting their victims, creating environments where sexual predation becomes systemic rather than aberrant. Modern corporations, religious organizations, entertainment industries, and political institutions have repeatedly demonstrated their capacity to replicate Roman patterns of institutional enablement, creating systems where sexual crimes by powerful figures are systematically covered up while victims are silenced through economic pressure, legal intimidation, and social ostracism. The specific mechanisms may have evolved, but the fundamental dynamics remain unchanged. When institutions prioritize protecting power over protecting people, they inevitably become machines for enabling sexual predation. Perhaps the most disturbing parallel between imperial Rome and modern society is how both systems create economic incentives for participating in sexual abuse, while making resistance economically devastating for potential whistleblowers. Roman aristocrats provided their family members for imperial sexual exploitation because refusing meant political and economic destruction. Modern victims and witnesses face similar calculations when confronting powerful sexual predators who control career opportunities, financial resources, and social access. The Roman practice of using sexual services as currency for political advancement has obvious parallels in modern industries where career success depends on tolerating or facilitating sexual exploitation by powerful figures. The underlying economics haven't changed. When survival depends on powerful people's approval, sexual crimes become invisible because acknowledging them threatens the economic foundations of entire social networks. Modern societies have developed their own versions of damnatio memoriae, using sophisticated public relations techniques, legal intimidation, and media manipulation to erase evidence of systematic sexual abuse while transforming sexual predators into celebrated public figures. The same psychological and social mechanisms that allowed Romans to worship emperors they knew were sexual criminals operate in contemporary societies that continue celebrating powerful figures whose sexual crimes are widely suspected but carefully hidden. Social media, legal settlements with non-disclosure agreements, and strategic philanthropy function as modern equivalents of Roman historical revisionism, creating alternative narratives that obscure sexual predation while maintaining the public reputations of powerful criminals. The technology has evolved, but the fundamental process remains identical: systematic manipulation of public perception to protect sexual predators from accountability. The most tragic aspect of Roman sexual terrorism is how completely modern societies have failed to learn from its obvious lessons about the relationship between concentrated power and systematic sexual abuse. Despite having detailed historical records of what happens when power becomes absolute, contemporary institutions continue creating the same structural conditions that made imperial sexual predation inevitable. Understanding Roman imperial sexual history isn't just academic curiosity, it's essential preparation for recognizing and preventing the systematic sexual abuse that emerges whenever societies fail to maintain effective checks on concentrated power. The emperors are dead, but the systems that created them live on, waiting for the next generation of victims and enablers to repeat history's most preventable tragedies. The marble has crumbled, but the patterns remain eternal. When the last Western Roman emperor was deposed in 476 CE, historians would later debate the causes of imperial collapse, barbarian invasions, economic decline, military weakness, political instability, but they largely ignored one of the most fundamental factors in Rome's destruction: civilization that had spent centuries systematically corrupting its own moral foundations through institutionalized sexual terrorism had ultimately lost the psychological capacity for the basic human cooperation necessary to maintain a functioning society. By the 4th century, the Roman Empire had become a civilization where every major institution, military, religious, political, economic, had been systematically corrupted through participation in imperial sexual crimes. The same generals who commanded armies had facilitated sexual slavery. The same priests who provided spiritual guidance had blessed sexual torture as divine ritual. The same senators who created laws had trafficked their own family members to sexual predators wearing purple robes. This wasn't just political corruption. It was civilizational moral collapse that destroyed the social trust necessary for institutional functionality. When every authority figure was complicit in systematic sexual crimes, when every institution had been weaponized for sexual predation, when survival required enthusiastic participation in moral atrocities, Roman society lost the capacity for the authentic leadership, genuine cooperation, and moral clarity that functional civilizations require. The barbarian invasions succeeded not because Roman armies lacked military skill, but because Roman society lacked the moral cohesion necessary to inspire soldiers to die defending a civilization they knew was fundamentally corrupt. Why sacrifice your life for an empire that had spent centuries treating human dignity as a commodity and sexual violence as entertainment? Perhaps most tragically, the Roman Empire's collapse wasn't imposed from outside. It was a form of collective psychological suicide by a civilization that had become psychologically incompatible with its own continued existence. Generations of Romans had been raised in institutional environments that normalized sexual violence while requiring enthusiastic participation in systematic moral atrocities disguised as political necessity and religious duty. The psychological damage was irreversible. Roman society had created populations who understood that survival required complicity in sexual crimes while maintaining the fiction that they lived in a moral civilization. This cognitive dissonance produced collective psychological exhaustion that manifested as political apathy, military desertion, economic decline, and religious despair, symptoms that historians interpret as imperial decline but which were actually evidence of mass psychological trauma from centuries of forced participation in institutional sexual terrorism. The fall of Rome stands as history's most comprehensive demonstration of what happens when societies prioritize protecting powerful sexual predators over protecting their victims. The empire that had conquered the known world ultimately destroyed itself through systematic sexual corruption that poisoned every institution and relationship, until the civilization became psychologically unsustainable. This isn't ancient history. It's a warning. The same structural dynamics that transformed Roman emperors into sexual monsters and Roman society into their enabler operate in every civilization where power becomes disconnected from accountability. The specific technologies may evolve, but the fundamental patterns remain constant. When societies fail to maintain effective checks on concentrated power, sexual predation becomes systematic, institutional corruption becomes comprehensive, and civilizational collapse becomes inevitable. Rome fell because it forgot that power without limits produces monsters without conscience, and societies that worship monsters inevitably become monstrous themselves. The marble has crumbled, the empire has fallen, but the lesson remains eternal. Civilizations that cannot protect their most vulnerable members from their most powerful predators will ultimately destroy themselves through their own moral corruption. The emperors are gone, but their warning echoes through history. This is what happens when power becomes absolute and accountability disappears. This is how empires die, not through conquest, but through the systematic destruction of their own souls. Still awake? If you found yourself drawn into tonight's mysteries, we've got more secrets waiting in the shadows. Just click to uncover what lies ahead. And hey, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so these late night revelations find their way to you whenever we unveil the next chapter